In the remote, inaccessible highlands of Tanzania's Serengeti National Park lived an old male elephant who had spent years in solitude. Known for his majesty in his youth, he had aged over time, his massive body sagging slightly, his tusks beginning to succumb to the harshness of time. His skin was now more wrinkled, his ears tired, and the massive tusks he used for defense were now cracked. He had once been the leader of a mighty herd, the earth that shook with his footsteps, the valleys that echoed with his trumpet-like voice, still remembered him. He had lived a long life filled with conflict, triumph, and sometimes loss. But as nature's immutable law requires, no power lasts forever. One day his knees weakened, his gait grew heavy, and he knew it was time to hand over his leadership to the younger generation. One morning, amidst the red light of the rising sun, he silently left his herd. He left behind the family he had protected for years, muddy swamps filled with memories, and lush riverbanks. He walked slowly towards solitude. His footprints bore the glorious days of the past. He set off for the distant mountains. There were few traces of people or animals on their steep cliffs. In one of nature's purest, quietest corners, a rocky area nestled in a narrow valley, he found a small shelter. This was now his new home. Every morning at first light, he would emerge from his burrow, his enormous ears pricked, listening to the roar of the wind. Sometimes he would raise his eyes to the sky and imagine the distant trumpeting of elephants, that deep, resonant voice he had once uttered. These memories now remained in his mind like a breeze, sad yet peaceful. His old body could no longer take long walks or move heavy objects easily, so he subsisted on the small fruit trees, puddles, and the occasional tubers he dug up from the ground. The wounds he had suffered years ago would occasionally throb, slowing his pace. But still, each day he clung to life, because living in this lonely life in nature with the traces of the past gave him both peace and a kind of meaning. Despite all the hardships, the old elephant clenched his tusks and continued this solitary existence. As the days passed, his body grew weaker, his steps heavier, his eyes less able to see as far as they once did. But within him was a strong will that held him to life. In this life wrought with loneliness, the knowledge that he would survive another day was enough for him when he opened his eyes each morning. His footprints were now almost invisible in the ground, but each trace bore the weight of years in the struggle for survival. To an outside eye, only an old elephant could see a slow walk, but within him lay the pain, memories, and resilience accumulated over the years. One afternoon, as the sky turned gray and the air grew heavy, he encountered a lone wildebeest wandering high on a mountainside. This was a rare opportunity. Although he no longer hunted prey so often, his instincts were still alive. For that moment, this wildebeest might be his last chance before night fell. The slope was so steep that even a young elephant could stumble. But the old elephant didn't hesitate. Gathering all his strength, he began to walk slowly. It was heavy, yes, but there was determination behind his steps. The antelope, his eyes wide with fear, bolted away beyond the cliffs. The old elephant dragged himself along on trembling legs. His heartbeat quickened, his breathing harsher. Every muscle in his body seemed to rebel, but the hunter's spirit within him said, "Go ahead." Then, as he stepped on a rock, it gave way and the elephant stumbled. Losing his balance, he was suddenly swept down the rocky cliff. The stones tumbled along with his massive body, dust flying into the air. The elephant lashed out with his powerful trunk and front legs, searching for a ledge to break his fall. He let out a harsh scream, the sound echoing throughout the valley. In the emptiness below, the mountain wind blew wildly, blowing the rocks away. The antelope had long since vanished. But the old elephant was now overcome not only by hunger, but also by disappointment. In the spot where he was trapped, he wedged his trunk between the rocks to keep from falling, pressing his cracked feet into the rock. Then he let out a second scream, this time longer, more heartbreaking. For hours, he struggled to pull his massive body up on that ledge. The initial effort was powerful. His voice echoed, and here and there, even the mountain goats recoiled in alarm. But as time went by, his screams turned to moans. It was as if the weight of years was now pressing down not only on his body, but also on his soul. At that moment, nature was not only merciless, but also silent. No one heard his cry, but the mountains, the wind, and the rocks bore witness to an old elephant's struggle for survival that day. Its massive trunk clung to the edge of the cliff, while the old elephant's feet slowly slid. His weight left shallow, long scratches on the rock surface. His trunk had begun to relax, his powerful leg muscles trembling. He seemed to have no strength left to resist. He gazed long into the sky, the gray, cloud-shrouded sky. His eyes reflected the weariness of years, a profound resignation. Perhaps this mountain would now be his final resting place. Neither the strength of youth nor the pride of leadership could help him anymore. He simply silently accepted his fall. But nature has a unique sense of humor. Sometimes, in the darkest of moments, a glimmer of hope emerges. At that moment, the vehicle of Kamau, one of the park's veteran rangers, was quietly moving along the winding mountain road. Kamau had dedicated his life to protecting wildlife, having worked in Serengeti National Park for years. He was a wildlife conservationist, well-versed in the behavior of wild animals, deeply aware of the pain and power of each species. That day, on his way back to the headquarters, he gazed out the window of his vehicle, lost in the wind-blown dust. Just then, he heard a faint moan, a sound mingled with the wind, yet real enough for the attentive ear to detect. He immediately pulled to the side of the road, shut off the engine, and listened intently. The sound came again, a little more distinct this time. Kamau's experienced heart immediately recognized it as an elephant's call. But it wasn't the defiant trumpet of a leader, but the wailing call of an old creature that's struggling with despair. He quietly got out of the vehicle, carrying only his binoculars, his small bag, and his first aid kit. He began to cautiously move in the direction of the sound. Stones crunched under his feet. The wind ruffled his clothes. After a few minutes of careful walking, his eyes caught sight of a massive gray object clinging to the mountainside. For a moment, his heart almost stopped. What he saw was an elephant's desperation. The old elephant stood at the edge of the cliff, its trunk wrapped around a rock to prevent itself from falling, its hind legs dangling in the hollow of the cliff. The sight was both shocking and painful. Kamau had encountered thousands of wild animals over the years, but this was the first time he had encountered such desperate, yet noble resistance. The thought of calling a rescue team crossed his mind, but his instincts told him time was running out. The old elephant's muscles were trembling, his eyelids were half open, exhaustion now etched into every part of his body. Kamau realized this elephant had been hanging there for hours, perhaps all day. He quickly considered the safest way to approach the animal without panicking. Any sudden movement could further stress the already frightened and exhausted animal. So he approached, speaking softly. "Hey, calm down," he whispered, as if the old elephant could understand human language. In fact, Kamau was speaking the language of nature, the language of trust, compassion, and patience. He took his steps carefully and gently. With each step, he gazed into the elephant's eyes, trying to establish a connection, because he knew that sometimes survival depends not only on physical assistance, but also on spiritual connection. Kamau crouched down carefully. He tried to soothe the old elephant's anxiety by softening his tone as much as possible. The wind of the dark valley scattered his whispers, but Kamau didn't give up. "Calm down, my friend. I won't hurt you," he murmured. His eyes locked with the elephant's, and at that moment, the old elephant lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met. It was a weak but profound gaze. It was as if the old elephant understood the stranger's intentions. He no longer had the warlike, defiant air of before. Even his trumpet-like voice had changed. It was now a hoarse, deep voice, both daunted and hopeful. Kamau took a few steps closer, his heart hammered in his chest. One move from this massive creature could have been his undoing, but he was on the side of compassion, not fear. "I will save you," he said softly, "but don't hurt me, please." The old elephant tilted his head slightly, slowly relaxed his trunk, and for a moment his gaze fixed on Kamau. In that moment, a bridge of trust, one that needed no words, was forged between the two creatures. It was as if the elephant understood what this man meant and chose to trust him. Kamau took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Waiting for a rescue team to arrive meant simply watching this animal take its last breath. He dug his knees into the ground, positioned himself, and gripped the elephant's front legs. In that moment, he felt the weight the old elephant's body carried, not just physically, but also spiritually. Experiences, losses, abandonment, everything seemed to have accumulated in those legs. At that moment, the elephant pressed his hind legs against the cliff with one last effort. Every second was a test, oscillating between hope and fear. Stones fell from above, dust burned his eyes, and Kamau's feet skidded on the rocks. Kamau clenched his teeth and pulled until his arms trembled. Sweat streamed down his back, his lungs burned as if they were about to burst. Osain, mission. But his eyes held only one thing: to save this animal. With one last push, he summoned all his strength and pulled the old elephant up. Suddenly, the rocks shook, the dust settled, and the elephant's massive body slid down onto the rock. Finally, Basof Ikiko, the old elephant sprawled on his back. His legs trembled, his chest heaving heavily, but he was alive, safe. Kamau retreated quickly, collapsing to the ground a few feet away. He was panting. His body had collapsed from exhaustion. He looked just as exhausted as the elephant. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence. Time seemed to have stopped in the valley. There was no sound of wind, no chirping of birds, only a silence filled with weariness and vitality. Minutes passed. The old elephant finally lifted his head slowly. He straightened, his front legs planted on the ground. Every movement was marked by resentment and old age, but also by gratitude, like a thankful gesture. The old elephant slowly shook his head. His trunk hovered briefly in the air, then descended slowly to the ground. Then he turned his gaze to Kamau. In his eyes, clouded by years of fatigue, illness, loneliness, and despair, a gratitude beyond words shone. This look was the expression of the raw emotion within one of nature's fiercest creatures. Kamau stood motionless. Sweat trickled down his forehead, running down his face. His breathing was still ragged, but a faint smile appeared on his face. In that moment, he knew. He might not have changed the world, but he had saved a life. And sometimes that was more meaningful than anything else. The old elephant began to walk slowly toward Kamau. His massive trunk shook the ground, but his steps held a calmness rather than a threat. Kamau instinctively wanted to retreat, his heart racing for a few moments. But the elephant's eyes held gratitude, not violence. His massive trunk bowed its head and reached down toward the ground. The gesture was like a greeting, a profound gratitude that transcended the barriers between species. Kamau sensed the significance of this gesture. Overcoming his fear, he reached out and gently touched the elephant's back. He patted the thick, dusty hide. It was a rare moment in the wild, a moment when a human and an elephant spoke heart to heart, without needing words. Kamau stepped back, a gleam in his eyes. He knew better than to get too close. Such bonds were precious, but he must remain distant. He slowly raised his hand as if bidding farewell. The old elephant raised his trunk, then responded with a deep but calm trumpet call. The sound was a thank you, a farewell, a sign of rebirth. Just then, the dark clouds that had covered the sky for hours began to slowly clear. The first rays of the sun filtered through the clouds and hit the valley. The light dancing on the elephant's back seemed to tell him that nature, too, had witnessed this salvation. Kamau walked slowly back to his car. Every now and then, he glanced back, wanting to make sure his old friend was still standing. The elephant followed, moving silently a few steps behind. His legs trembled with each step, but he continued without falling. He accompanied him to the car, as if sending a friend off. As Kamau opened the door, he turned his head once more. The elephant had stopped. He watched him with only his eyes. In those eyes, there was not the sorrow of losing a friend, but the profound respect of a life debt. Kamau started the engine and slowly drove off. He took one last look in the rearview mirror. The old elephant was still there, his head slightly tilted to the side. His gray skin gleamed golden in the sun. And that day, in the mountains of the Serengeti, not only was a rescue accomplished, it was a day when a silent friendship was born between man and beast. And that bond, needing no words, would be remembered forever. Kamau climbed into his car and quietly closed the door. But his eyes were still fixed on the old elephant. Before the engine started, an image flashed through his mind. This elephant's youth. Those days when he walked proudly. Those days when he stood tall before his herd. Those moments when he ruled the valleys with that majestic trumpet call. Time had been merciless. It had exhausted his body, worn down his teeth, weakened his muscles. But it had never erased his pride. The traces of that leadership still shone in the old elephant's eyes. Kamau took a deep breath, started the engine, and slowly turned toward the dirt road leading to the administrative center. At the same time, the old elephant bowed his head, looked at Kamau once more, and then began to walk slowly deeper into the forest. Every step left traces of the past in the ground, each step carrying a memory. Two beings of two different species, two worlds so unlike each other in the midst of nature. Yet their hearts had beaten in the same place that day. A wordless yet powerful bond had formed between them. That bond was a symbol of defending life, compassion, and unconditional help. The sky cleared and the dark clouds dispersed. The sun's rays filtered through the clouds, striking the elephant's back and Kamau's face. It was as if nature were blessing the salvation of these two lives. Kamau glanced once more in the car mirror. The old elephant was now at the edge of the forest, but he stopped. He raised his head and trumpeted softly into the distance. That sound wasn't a farewell, but a thank you. For life, for salvation, for friendship. Kamau knew that moment was etched in his memory forever. The image of that lonely, weary, yet honored elephant would live on in his memory for years to come. Likewise, the old elephant was certain to remember this moment of salvation. Perhaps he too would remember Kamau at the first light of each new day, carrying in his heart the mark of human kindness. And now the steep cliffs of Serengeti National Park bore witness not only to the hardships of life in the wild, but also to the compassion born from the human heart. The story ends with the quiet trumpet call of an old elephant lost in the forest, a melody of thanks whispered to nature, echoing like a song of life. My dear friend, thank you for following this touching story with us until the end. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel to support us.